The British Museum, London. Department of the Middle East, late afternoon. The hum of fluorescent lighting holds steady over the glass cases. Visitors have begun to thin out in the galleries beyond. Inside one of these cases, behind reinforced glass, rests a clay tablet smaller than a human hand. It is rectangular, about 15 centimetres by 10, beige, almost grey in places where the kiln firing went uneven. The cuneiform script that covers both faces was pressed into its surface roughly 2,700 years ago. The tablet has a name in the museum catalogue. It is BM 86378. The label beside it reads simply MUL.APIN, Tablet I. If you lean closer, your breath fogging slightly on the glass, you will see the wedges. Tiny triangular impressions, made by a reed stylus drawn carefully through wet clay. Each wedge a syllable, each line a sentence, each tablet a window onto a way of seeing the sky that no one alive today fully shares. Toward the middle of the second column, near a small chip in the edge, there are 3 lines of cuneiform that have been translated and retranslated by scholars for over a century. The translation has stabilized. It now reads as follows. One big star, although its light is dim, divides the sky in half and stands there. That is the star of Marduk, Nibiru, Jupiter. It keeps changing its position and crosses the sky. Roughly 2,700 years ago, a scribe in the Assyrian city of Assur, pressing his stylus into wet clay, identified a star by 3 names. The first was the great god of Babylon, Marduk. The second was a celestial term whose meaning has occupied scholars for 150 years, Nibiru, crossing. The third was an old Sumerian word for the planet we today, in English called Jupiter. The tablet is real, the line is real, the name is real. Nibiru is in the cuneiform record. It always was. Tonight, we are going to walk through what this tablet actually says. We are going to walk through what 12 other tablets like it actually say. And we are going to walk through what the scholars who spent their lives reading them have actually concluded. Slowly, with patience, with the kind of attention that the clay itself was made to reward. The tablet has waited nearly 3,000 years to be understood on its own terms. We can take our time with it. This is for the wanderer who keeps wondering whether the history we were given is complete. For the curious mind who has heard the name Nibiru spoken in many ways, by many voices, and who would like, just once, to hear what the original scribes meant. Now let us begin where the Babylonians and the Sumerians said it all began, not with a planet, not with a theory, with the sky itself, and with a civilization that watched it longer, and more carefully, than almost any other in human history. Mesopotamia. The word is Greek. It means the land between the rivers. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They rise in the mountains of what is now southeastern Turkey and flow southward, parallel, for roughly 1,500 kilometers before they meet, and then run together, as a single stream, into the Persian Gulf. The land between them is mostly flat. In summer it bakes. In winter it floods. There is almost no native stone, almost no native timber. What it has, in abundance, is clay. Clay does not hurry. Clay does not forget. Clay outlasts kings. This is the soil on which the first cities of the human story were built. By the year 3500 before the Common Era, in the southern half of this land, in the marshes near the Persian Gulf, a people we now call the Sumerians had already constructed walled towns with populations in the tens of thousands. They had irrigation canals. They had grain silos. They had temples raised on rectangular platforms of mud brick that rose in stepped tiers above the floodplain. They had pottery wheels and beer brewing, and the world's first true writing system. Their language was unrelated to anything else then or now. They called it Ame-Gir, the native tongue. Their writing they pressed into clay with cut reeds, wedge-shaped marks, cunus in Latin, cuneiform. By 3200 before the Common Era, they were keeping records. By 2500 they were writing literature. By 1800 the literature included a tablet, recovered from the city of Larsa, and now resting in a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, that opened with a single line so haunting that it has been quoted for a century since. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu. The tablet is called the Weld Blundell Prism. It is a 4-sided clay block about 20 centimetres tall and 9 centimetres wide on each side. Its accession number is AN 1923.4. It was donated to the museum in 1923 by Herbert Weld Blundell, who had funded the British expedition that recovered it the previous year from the ruins of Lhasa. It contains the most complete known copy of what scholars today call the Sumerian king list. That list will matter again later in this story. For now, hold the image. A four-sided block of clay, 20 centimetres tall, inscribed on every side, opening with kings whose reigns are measured not in decades, but in thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. The total reign of the 8 kings before the flood on this single prism comes to 241,200 years. There is something about those numbers that should make us pause. They are too specific to be poetic license, too long to be flattery to a living king. They sit in the clay, in cuneiform that has not changed across copy after copy for nearly 4,000 years, and they ask to be read. For now, set the prism aside. We will return to it. The Sumerians did not last. By the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, their cities were absorbed into larger empires speaking Akkadian, a Semitic language unrelated to Sumerian. By the time of Hammurabi of Babylon, in the early 2nd millennium, Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language anywhere on Earth. But it survived. It survived the way Latin survived in medieval Europe. It survived as the language of literature, of liturgy, of education. Every Babylonian and Assyrian scribe who copied an astronomical tablet, well into the 1st millennium before the Common Era, learned Sumerian first. They learned it from older tablets, in schools called Ajuba, by copying texts from teachers who had themselves learned it the same way. The result is that when we read a tablet from the 7th century, before the Common Era, in Akkadian, with Sumerian loanwords embedded in it, we are reading something that consciously preserves layers stretching back 2,000 years. The vocabulary of the gods, the framework of the calendar, the names of the stars. The question we are walking toward, the question of Nibiru, is not really a question about kings. It is a question about the sky, and the people who wrote those tablets in Sumer, and after them in Akkad, and after them in Babylon, and after them again in Assyria, watched the sky with a patience that has no modern equivalent. They watched it for religious reasons. Every visible star, every visible planet, every recurring motion of the moon and the sun was understood as the visible body of a god. The sky was not metaphor. The sky was a text being written, line by line in real time, by the great gods of the pantheon. They watched it for practical reasons. Their year was lunar. Their calendar tracked the rising and setting of stars to know when to flood the fields, when to harvest the barley, when to bring the herds down from the high pastures. To miscount the heavens was to miscount the seasons, and they watched it for what we would now call scientific reasons, though they would not have used that word. They kept records. Generation after generation, scribe after scribe, the observations were copied, and added to, and copied again. By the time we reach the Neo-Assyrian period in the 7th century before the Common Era, the observational record stretches back more than 1,000 years. That continuity is the thing modern readers miss. When we look at a clay tablet from the reign of Ashurbanipal, dated around the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era, we are not looking at a fresh idea. We are looking at the 700th copy of a text composed centuries earlier, in turn drawing on tablet traditions stretching back to the old Babylonian period, the Babylonian Astronomical Compendium MUL. MUL.APIN, the tablet we began with, was likely composed around the year 1000 before the Common Era. The oldest extant manuscript we have in the British Museum was copied around the year 687. The text it preserves is older than the manuscript by several centuries. The observations it preserves are older still. This is why scholars treat Mesopotamian astronomy with the seriousness they do. It is not folk astronomy. It is not a tribe of priests guessing at the stars. It is a continuous, written, professional tradition, lasting from at least the 2nd millennium, before the Common Era, until the death of Hellenistic Babylon. 2,000 years of clay, 2,000 years of measurement, 2,000 years of recording what they saw. To understand Nibiru, we have to understand the people who wrote the word. The world outside of Mesopotamia, of course, had forgotten all of this. By the time the Greek geographer Strabo travelled through the region in the 1st century of our era, the cities themselves had become mounds of clay and brick under the soil. The cuneiform script had ceased to be readable by anyone, anywhere, by the late 1st century after Christ. For nearly 2,000 years after that, no one on earth could read what the Mesopotamians had written. The recovery began in earnest in the middle of the 19th century. In 1843, in the hills northeast of Mosul, in what was then the Ottoman province of Iraq, a French consul named Paul Botta broke through a layer of packed earth at a mound called Khorsabad and found himself standing in a room that had not been entered in over 25 centuries. It was, as he would later realise, a palace of Sargon II, king of Assyria, who had reigned in the late 8th century before the Common Era. 6 years later, in 1849, an English traveller and self-taught archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard began excavations at the mound of Kuyunjik, on the outskirts of Mosul. Beneath layers of debris, he found the burned ruins of the palace of Sennacherib. And beneath those ruins, in a series of small rooms with collapsed ceilings, he found something that no one at that point had ever seen in such quantity. Tablets. Thousands of them. Eventually, more than 30,000 fragments, in cuneiform script. What he had found, though he did not yet know it, was the library of Ashurbanipal, the grandson of Sennacherib, the 7th century king, who in his royal inscriptions boasted of being able to read even the most difficult cuneiform texts written before the flood. The tablets came back to London. They sat, packed in crates, in the storerooms of the British Museum, while a generation of scholars laboured to recover the language they were written in. The cuneiform script was being decoded piece by piece throughout the second half of the 19th century. In 1872, a self-educated banknote engraver turned Assyriologist named George Smith, working in a small office at the British Museum, opened one of those tablets and began reading. What he read, as the lines clarified beneath his lamp, was a Babylonian story of a great flood. A man warned by his god, a boat, animals, a bird sent out to find dry land. He had found, written in cuneiform several centuries older than the book of Genesis, an independent account of the same flood. He stood up. He walked around his desk. He removed his coat and, by the account of his colleagues, danced briefly across the room. We do not have to take that detail on faith. The colleagues wrote it down. What Smith and his successors had begun to recover, in those decades, was not only the literature of the Old Testament's distant cousins. It was the astronomical and cosmological vocabulary of an entire civilization. Within those crates of tablets from Nineveh were copies of Enūma Eliš, the great Babylonian creation epic. There were copies of MUL.APIN, the astronomical compendium. There were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There were omen texts, mathematical tables, observations of eclipses, and lunar phases going back centuries. The serious modern work on the meaning of those texts began in earnest in the middle of the 20th century. The German Assyriologist Benno Landsberger, together with the British scholar J.V. Kinnear Wilson, published the first careful reconstruction of the 5th tablet of Enūma Eliš in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1961. That paper opened the question of what Nibiru actually was. The work was carried forward by Wilfred Lambert at the University of Birmingham, whose definitive critical edition of the Babylonian creation myths appeared posthumously in 2013. By Herman Hunger and David Pingree, whose joint edition of MUL.APIN, published in 1989, gave the world a translation that scholars still use today. By Wayne Horowitz at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who studied under Lambert and published the standard study of Mesopotamian cosmic geography in 1998. By Francesca Rochberg at the University of California, Berkeley, whose work on the heavenly writing established how the Mesopotamian astronomers actually saw the sky. Lambert, Hunger, Pingree, Horowitz, Rochberg. These are the names that matter when one wants to understand what the cuneiform sources actually say. The careful, multilingual, decade-by-decade work of recovering what a scribe in Assur once meant by the word Nibiru. In those texts repeatedly, there was the word, a word that meant something specific to the people who wrote it down, a word that named alternately a great god, a great star, a planet, a celestial crossing point, the meridian where heaven and earth meet. The word was Nibiru, in modern English transliteration, often Nibiru. What it actually meant, in the technical Akkadian astronomy preserved on those tablets, is the story we are about to walk through together. Because the question of what Nibiru is, when read carefully in the original cuneiform, is not the question that most people today have in their heads when they hear the word. The clay can tell us. It has been waiting. Now let us begin with the word itself, Nibiru, Ne-Beru, in the carefully syllabic transliteration that Assyriologists use to render the Akkadian. 3 syllables. The first carries the long vowel that the cuneiform sign signals with a vertical stroke, Ne-Bi-Ru. 2 of those syllables taken together form the heart of the meaning. The Akkadian language, like Hebrew, like Arabic, like Aramaic, is built on 3-letter verbal roots. From each root, by varying the vowels and adding prefixes and suffixes, the speaker generates dozens of related words. The root behind Nibiru is the verb eberu, to cross over, to go from one side of something to the other, to pass through a barrier. In its most literal early usage, attested in old Akkadian texts from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, it meant the action of crossing a river. From the verb came the noun. A Nibiru, in its most concrete sense, is a crossing place, a ford, the shallow stretch of water where a man might step from one bank to the other. By extension, in later texts, it could mean the boat that ferried a traveller across, or the ferryman himself, or, by a further widening, the point of transition between 2 domains. The full lexical entry occupies several columns in the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the great 21-volume reference work compiled by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago between the years 1956 and 2011. Volume N, Part 2, page 145. The entries collect every attested usage of the word from the entire surviving corpus of cuneiform tablets: crossing place, ford, ferryboat, point of transition. That is the literal meaning of the word. Now consider what happens when an ancient Babylonian scribe applies this word to the sky. The sky is not water. There are no rivers in it. There is no ferryman waiting at a shallow place to take you across. And yet, the word Nibiru appears in astronomical contexts, on tablet after tablet, for over 1,000 years. Something in the sky was a crossing place. Something in the sky was a point of transition. Something in the sky moved, or was fixed, at the place where 2 domains met. To understand what, we need to keep the literal sense of the word in our minds while we walk into the way the Mesopotamians actually saw the heavens. But first, one more turn through the riverbank, meaning, because it matters. Because the Mesopotamians themselves loved this word, and used it, and put it into the mouths of their oldest stories. Open the Epic of Gilgamesh. The standard Babylonian version, the one preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal, edited definitively in the year 2003 by Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. 2 volumes, Oxford University Press, hardback in dark green cloth, the fullest scholarly edition of the epic that exists in any language. Open it to tablet 10. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, has been wandering for over a year. His friend Enkidu is dead. He cannot accept this. He has left the city, left the wall he built, left the kingship behind, and he is looking for the one human being who is said to have survived the Great Flood. The man called Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah before the Greek one. The survivor who, alone among mortals, was granted immortality by the gods. To reach him, Gilgamesh must cross a body of water that has no exact equivalent in any other text. The waters of death. A barrier between the world of the living and the place where the immortal one now dwells. And on the near shore of that water stands a single figure. A ferryman. His name in the Akkadian text is Ur-Shanabi. His name in the deeper Akkadian, the technical name that scholars sometimes use, is MUL.APIN, the man of Ea, the man of the god of wisdom, the god of the fresh waters under the earth. He keeps a boat. He alone can guide a traveller across the waters of death. In the original Akkadian, the verb describing what he does is built from the same root we have been tracing. He performs an act of eberu. He brings the traveller from one side to the other, from the realm of the mortal to the place where the survivor of the flood now lives without dying. The crossing place itself, in the language of the text, is a kind of neberu. This is the layer beneath the word. Before the word was ever applied to a star, it was applied to the most loaded crossing in the entire literature of Mesopotamia. The crossing between life and death, the the crossing between the world we know and the world the gods withdrew to after the flood. The crossing only one human had made and returned from, when, centuries later, a Babylonian astronomer looked up at a certain point in the sky and saw something that he understood to be a fixed station of crossing, and reached for a word to name it. This is the word he reached for. We are not yet at the star. We are still at the riverbank. But you can see, perhaps, how the word had already done a great deal of work in the imagination of the people who would later use it for the heavens. Now let us walk up from the riverbank into the night sky. The Babylonians did not see the sky we see today. The constellations they recognized overlap with ours in some places. Leo, Taurus, Scorpius. These come down to us from them, through Greek intermediaries, with very little change. But the deeper organization of the sky, the way they grouped stars into bands and assigned them to gods, has no surviving parallel in modern Western astronomy. They divided the sky into 3 roads, 3 paths, 3 highways across the dome of heaven. The middle path, the one that ran roughly along what we today call the celestial equator, the band of stars through which the sun and the moon and the visible planets all travelled, they called the path of Anu. Anu was the sky god, the oldest of the great gods by some reckonings. The path of Anu was his road. By the calculations preserved in the astronomical compendium MUL.APIN, it spanned a band of about 17 degrees on either side of the celestial equator. That is a wide road, wide enough to contain almost everything that moves in the night sky. To the north of the path of Anu lay the path of Enlil. Enlil was the god of the storm, the god of the air, the god whose decree in the older Sumerian theology set the pattern of human destiny. His path of stars ran from the upper edge of Anu's road up toward the celestial pole and around it. The circumpolar stars, the ones that never set in the latitudes of southern Iraq, were Enlil's. To the south of the path of Anu lay the path of Ea. Ea, the Akkadian name for the older Sumerian Enki, was the god of the fresh waters that the Babylonians believed lay beneath the earth, the Apsu, the deep. He was also the god of wisdom and craft. His path of stars ran from the lower edge of Anu's road down toward the southern horizon. Many of those stars, in the latitude of Babylon, just barely cleared the horizon at their highest. Stars we today would identify as parts of Argo, the lower stars of Centaurus. 3 paths, 3 gods, 1 sky divided in 3. This is the framework. Hold it in mind when we open the Enūma Eliš in a few moments and read what the Babylonian creation epic says about the act by which the god Marduk organized the heavens. This is the geometry we are looking at. The earliest text we have that organizes the sky in this way is a tablet called Astrolabe B. Its museum number is KAV 218. It rests today, lit in a glass case, in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, inside the Pergamon complex on Museum Island. The tablet was recovered from the ruins of Assur, the old religious capital of Assyria, during the German excavations of Walter André between the years 1903 and 1914. Its date, as established by the colophon and by the script style, is roughly the year 1100 before the Common Era, the Middle Assyrian period, the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, more or less. The tablet is small, about the size of a paperback book. It is a single piece, broken across one corner, but legible on most of its surface. The standard edition was published by Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the year 2014, in a volume titled The 3 Stars Each, the Astrolabes and Related Texts. What the tablet does is simple, in concept. It lists for each of the 12 months of the Babylonian year 3 stars, 1 from the path of Anu, 1 from the path of Enlil, 1 from the path of Ea. Each star is the one that the Babylonian astronomers believed should rise heliacally, meaning rise just before the sun rose in that particular month. The whole tablet is a kind of seasonal calendar of the heavens, a way of telling the time of year by looking up. And on Astrolabe B, in the columns devoted to the months around the equinoxes, the word Nibiru begins to appear. Attached to stars near the celestial equator, stars that mark the boundary, the crossing point, between one half of the sky and the other. This is the beginning of the technical, astronomical use of the word, from a fixed crossing place on a river to a fixed crossing place in the sky. The same conceptual move, the same word. The riverbank and the meridian held together in 3 syllables. The astrolabe is not the most famous of the Babylonian astronomical texts. That title belongs, by a long margin, to the tablet we have already met. The MUL.APIN compendium. 2 tablets, several hundred lines of cuneiform. A coherent body of astronomical knowledge composed around the year 1000 before the Common Era, and copied, with very little change, for over 400 years after that. The oldest extant manuscript we have of MUL.APIN bears, on its colophon, the date of 687 before the Common Era. Its museum numbers are VAT 9412 and VAT 11279. 2 fragments, 1 joined tablet, also resting in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, also recovered from Assur. The colophon, which is a kind of scribal signature added at the end of the tablet, tells us the name of the scribe, the name of the king, and the year. The king was Sennacherib. The year was the 17th of his reign. The scribe's name has faded. The best preserved copy of Tablet 1, the copy that gives us the canonical version of the passage we began with, is the British Museum tablet BM 86378, found at Nineveh, now in the Department of the Middle East, behind the glass case where this story began. What MUL.APIN does is something that no other surviving ancient civilization had yet done. It compiles in one organized text the names of the visible stars and constellations, the dates of their heliacal risings, the months of the year, the assignment of stars to the 3 paths of Anu, Enlil, and Ea, and the rules for understanding the motions of the planets. It is, in essence, the first known astronomical handbook, the standard reference of Babylonian astronomy for the entire first millennium before the Common Era. The editors of the modern critical edition, Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna and the late David Pingree of Brown University, published their joint edition in the year 1989 in a volume titled MUL.APIN, an astronomical compendium in cuneiform. A revised edition appeared by Hunger together with John Steele of Brown in 2018 from Routledge. These 2 volumes are the standard texts on which every modern discussion of Babylonian astronomy rests. In Tablet 1 of MUL.APIN, the second column, lines 33 through 35, the lines we read at the very beginning of this story, the compendium says, in the careful Akkadian of the scribe, 1 big star. Its light, although dim, divides the sky in half and stands there. That is the star of Marduk, Nibiru, Jupiter. 3 names, 1 star, 1 celestial body, identified by Hunger and Pingree with confidence as Jupiter. The planet we today still call Jupiter, the largest of the visible planets in our solar system, the one Galileo would point a telescope at 2,500 years after this tablet was inscribed to see its 4 largest moons. This is the foundation. This is the textual moment that anchors the conventional, scholarly understanding of what Nibiru is. Jupiter, the star of Marduk, the crossing star of the meridian. But the story does not stop with MUL.APIN. There is another text, older and stranger, and more theologically loaded than the compendium, in which the word Nibiru appears in a context that is not quite the same. It is in this older text that the word is bound, not only to a single planet, but to the entire structure of the cosmos as the Babylonians understood it. That text is the Enūma Eliš, the Babylonian creation epic, and it is to the Enūma Eliš and to what it actually says about the celestial station of Nibiru that we now turn. Now let us walk into the Enūma Eliš properly. The poem itself is old, older than MUL.APIN by perhaps 2 or 3 centuries. The composite text that scholars today reconstruct goes back, in its core form, to the Kassite period in Babylonia, roughly the years 1200 to 1100 before the Common Era. The Kassites were a foreign dynasty who ruled Babylon for nearly 4 centuries, from about 1595 to 1155, and during their reign, the cult of Marduk, the city god of Babylon, was elevated to its mature theological form. The Enūma Eliš is, in essence, the foundational charter of that elevation, a poem composed to explain why Marduk, the patron deity of a particular city, deserved to be considered the king of all the gods. But for over 2.5 millennia, the poem was lost. Not lost in the sense of completely vanished. Echoes of it survived in the writings of the Greek author Damasius in the 3rd century of the Common Era, who preserved a Greek transliteration of the opening words. Other classical sources made glancing references, but the actual text, in its own language, on its own clay, was buried. It came back to the world in the autumn of 1872. The man who brought it back was named George Smith. He was 32 years old, the son of a London craftsman, and he had no university education. He had learned cuneiform on his own, in the evenings, after working all day at his trade as an engraver of banknotes. He had been hired by the British Museum, against the wishes of most of the established scholars, on the strength of his self-taught reading ability. By the autumn of 1872, Smith was working in the museum's basement, sorting through cases of unprocessed tablets that had been shipped from Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard and his successors over the previous 2 decades. The tablets had been excavated, they had been packed in crates, they had been sent across the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic to London. And then, for the most part, they had been forgotten. The museum's senior staff had no time, and not enough trained readers to work through the backlog. Smith opened a case. He picked up a fragment. He brushed it off. He began to read. What he found that afternoon was a portion of the Babylonian flood story. The story of a man named Utnapishtim, who built a boat and survived a great deluge sent by the gods. The story that, in its broad outlines, matches the story of Noah in the book of Genesis, to a degree that, in the religious climate of Victorian England, would cause a sensation. Smith presented his findings on December 3rd, 1872, to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, attended the lecture. The newspapers wrote about it for weeks. The Daily Telegraph offered to fund a follow-up expedition to Nineveh, with Smith leading it to look for more of the missing fragments. He went. He found more. He died of dysentery in northern Syria on the return from his 3rd expedition in 1876. He was 36. Among the tablets Smith had read before his death was a poem he called the Babylonian Genesis. The text he published in 1876, under the title The Chaldean Account of Genesis, contained the earliest English translation of the Enūma Eliš. It was incomplete. It had gaps. Many of the readings were tentative, but it gave the modern world its first sustained encounter with the cosmological text that lies in many ways behind the entire later religious imagination of the ancient Near East. The poem is composed of 7 tablets. Each tablet contains, on average, between 100 and 200 lines of Akkadian verse. The total composition runs to over 1,000 lines. The 7 tablets together would have been recited, almost certainly, during the great spring festival of Babylon, the Akitu festival, which was held in the 1st month of the Babylonian year, the month of Nisanu, around the time of the spring equinox. Imagine the scene. The king of Babylon, dressed in white linen, stands before the cult image of Marduk inside the Asagila, the great temple of the god in the centre of the city. The high priests, dressed similarly, surround him. The poem is recited from beginning to end, the 7 tablets of cosmic creation, of the war among the gods, of the slaying of the dragon Tiamat by the young hero Marduk, of the fashioning of the cosmos from her body, of the assembly of the gods proclaiming Marduk king of heaven and earth. It is the closest thing the ancient Mesopotamian world had to a sacred scripture in the modern sense. The story without which the city of Babylon would not have made sense to itself. The first 4 tablets tell the war story. The cosmos begins with 2 waters, Apsu, the male, the fresh subterranean water, and Tiamat, the female, the saltwater dragon. The chaos before form. The 2 waters mingle. Younger gods are born. The younger gods are noisy. Apsu wishes to destroy them. He is killed by Ea before he can act. Before. Tiamat then arises in her own right, in her primordial form, to avenge her partner. She fashions an army of monsters. She raises up a champion of the older order, the god Kingu, to lead the army against the younger gods. The young gods are terrified. None of them, in council after council, will face Tiamat in battle. Then Marduk steps forward, a young god, the son of Ea. He says he will fight Tiamat, but only if the assembly of the gods grants him kingship, and the right to fix destinies and command over all the others. The gods agree. They test him. They watch him destroy and recreate a garment by the power of his word alone. They are satisfied. They give him the rights he has demanded. He goes to war. Tablet of 4 is the battle. Marduk arms himself with the four winds, with a chariot drawn by storm horses, with a bow of polished cedar, with a net to entrap the dragon, with a flood weapon, with a club of lightning. He meets Tiamat in single combat. He shoots an arrow through her open mouth. She falls, and then comes the act that the Enūma Eliš makes the centre of the whole poem, the act we are about to walk into, because it is from this act that the celestial station of Nibiru is born. Marduk splits her body in two. The text says, in line 137 of tablet I4, he split her like a flat fish into two halves. Half of her body, the upper half, he raised up to form the sky. The other half, the lower half, he pressed down to form the earth. And from her ribs, her bones, her organs, her tears, her eyes, her saliva, he fashioned the various features of the world. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow from her eyes. The mountain ranges are her breasts. The arch of heaven is her belly. This is the cosmological move that all later Mesopotamian astronomy presupposes. The sky is not empty space. The sky is a body, the body of a slain primordial being. To read the patterns of the stars is to read the surface of a corpse made into a world. Now Tablet 5 begins. The very first line of Tablet 5 in the Akkadian reads, Ibni ma manzaza ana ilani rabuti. He fashioned the stations for the great gods. The word at the heart of that line is manzazu. It is built from the verbal root nazazu, which means simply to stand. A manzazu is a standing place, a station, a fixed position where something or someone is meant to be. The word will recur in the lines that follow, as Marduk shapes the sky into a structure of fixed positions, each one assigned to a particular god. Lambert's translation of the opening lines of Tablet 5, in his 2013 edition, runs like this. He fashioned the stations for the great gods. He fixed the stars, the constellations, their counterparts. He ordained the year, marked off its divisions. For each of the 12 months, he set up 3 constellations. After he had patterned the days of the year by means of constellations, he founded the station of Nibiru to fix the bands of the sky. So that none would transgress or fall short, he set up the stations of Enlil and Ea beside it. Read those lines carefully. They are the textual foundation of everything that comes later. He founded the station of Nibiru to fix the bands of the sky. He set up the stations of Enlil and Ea beside it. 3 stations, 3 fixed positions in the heavens, established by Marduk after he has built the sky from the body of Tiamat. Anu, who in this passage is implicit, since Nibiru is his station, the middle station, the meridian. Enlil to the north, Ea to the south, the same 3 roads of the gods across the dome that the MUL.APIN compendium would, centuries later, codify into a technical handbook. But here, in the older Enūma Eliš, the geometry is given a theological weight that the technical astronomy of MUL.APIN does not quite carry. Here, the stations are not just useful divisions of the sky for tracking the seasons. They are the architecture of the cosmos itself, the structure that holds the bands of heaven in place, the fixed points without which the universe would unravel into chaos again. The verb that Lambert translates as founded in the phrase he founded the station of Nibiru is built from the Akkadian root kanu, to establish firmly, to make permanent, to set in such a way that what is set cannot be moved. The same root that the legal texts of Babylonia use when a king establishes a boundary stone or when a contract establishes a transfer of land. It is the verb of permanent setting. Nibiru is set firmly. The stations of Enlil and Ea are set beside it, permanently. The pattern of the sky, once made, cannot be undone. Hold this in mind because it matters for what comes next. The Babylonian astronomers, when they looked up at the actual sky, did not see a permanent pattern. They saw, like us, a sky in which most things move, and a few things appear to stand still. The fixed stars in their patterns drift across the sky on a single great rotation that takes one night. The planets wander. The sun and moon trace their seasonal paths. Nothing stays in one place from one hour to the next. So when the poem says that Nibiru is set permanently, the question becomes, what does that mean? In observational terms, what is the body in the sky that, from the viewpoint of a Mesopotamian astronomer, occupies the station of Nibiru? The answer that MUL.APIN gives, as we have seen, is Jupiter. But the answer the Enūma Eliš seems to give is different. Or perhaps deeper, the Enūma Eliš is not describing Jupiter exactly. It is describing the place itself, the crossing point, the function, the station where the bands of the sky meet and are held. Jupiter, in the MUL.APIN passage, is the body that occupies that station at a given moment. But the station is the deeper thing. The station is what was founded, what stands, what cannot be moved. To understand the distinction, we have to follow the poem a little further, past the opening of Tablet 5, into the section where Marduk continues his work of cosmic ordering. The text, after fixing the three stations, turns to the moon and the sun. The moon is told to grow and shrink in a precise rhythm, marking the months. The sun is told to make the round of the heavens, marking the days. The clouds and the winds, the rivers and the rains, all are assigned to their stations. The cosmos, by the end of Tablet 5, is fully built. The bands of the sky are fixed. The luminaries are running. The earth is shaped. The waters are bounded. What remains is for the gods to acclaim Marduk as their king, and for humanity to be made to serve them. That happens in Tablet 6. The gods gather. They give Marduk the kingship he was promised. They build him a temple, the Asagula, in Babylon, as his eternal residence. They proclaim him, and then comes Tablet 7. Tablet 7 of the Enūma Eliš is one of the strangest texts in all of Mesopotamian literature. It is, in essence, a single very long act of naming. 50 names of Marduk recited one by one, each name carrying with it a portion of Marduk's identity and power. The names are theological titles drawn from many different traditions, gathered into one poetic structure. They function like a litany, a rosary of the chief god of Babylon. The names start with Marduk himself, the name everyone knows, the name written Damar, UD in the cuneiform, and then they proceed through 49 variations. Names like Asalui, Asaru, Tutu, Ziukin, Lugal Dimmer, and Kie. Most of these names were already old, in the Kassite period when the poem was assembled. Many of them belonged originally to other gods, whose powers had been absorbed into Marduk as he became the king of the pantheon. The 50th name comes at the very end of the poem, the culminating title. The name that, in some sense, the whole 1,000 lines of the Enūma Eliš have been working toward. The 50th name is Nibiru, Tablet 7, lines 124 through 131, in Lambert's translation. Nibiru shall hold the crossings of heaven and earth, so that none above or below shall pass through, they shall await him. Nibiru is his star, which he made appear in the sky. He took up his station at the turning point. They will look upon him as Nibiru, who holds the midst of it. To him they shall assign the paths of the stars of heaven. He shall shepherd all the gods like sheep. Let him conquer Tiamat. Let her life be cut short and distant. Read it slowly. There is something in those lines that is unlike anything else in the poem. Nibiru shall hold the crossings of heaven and earth. He took up his station at the turning point. He shall shepherd all the gods like sheep. The 50th name of Marduk, the highest and most secret of his 50 names, is not a name of war or kingship or fertility or wisdom. It is the name of a fixed celestial point, the crossing point, the station at the turning point of the sky, the place at the middle, the meridian, the equator line where the heavens are held in their balance. What moves me about this passage, when I sit with it late at night, is the symmetry of what it accomplishes. The poem began in Tablet 1 with chaos before form, the two primordial waters mingling, the cosmos as a single undifferentiated mass without bands or boundaries or stations. The poem ends, in Tablet 7, with the culminating name of the god who fixed the bands, the name that names the act itself, the crossing, the point of held balance, the thing without which the cosmos would unravel back into the chaos from which it came. Nibiru is that name. Nibiru is that point. And now, with the poem closed and the 50th name still hanging in the lamplight of the scriptorium, we can turn to the question that the modern reader inevitably brings to this material. What did the Babylonian astronomers actually see in the sky when they used this word? What did they see when the priests of Babylon stood on the ziggurats at dusk and watched for the first stars to break the deepening blue? When the omen readers of Nineveh, 2 centuries later, sat hunched over their wax tablets and pressed their notations into the soft surface? When the compiler of MUL.APIN, working late in some Assyrian scriptorium around the year 1000 before the Common Era, gathered the observations of countless predecessors into a single, coherent handbook. What was the object in the sky that they looked toward when they spoke the name Nibiru? For most of the period in which the word was in use, the answer was Jupiter. Now let us read the MUL.APIN passage directly. The text occurs in Tablet 1, Column 2, lines 33 through 36. In the edition of Hermann Hunger and David Pingree, published in 1989, the lines run as follows. One big star, although its light is dim, divides the sky in half and stands there. That is the star of Marduk, Nibiru, Jupiter. It keeps changing its position and crosses the sky. Read those 4 lines slowly. Every word in them's doing work. One big star. The Akkadian phrase is kakabu rabu. The word for star, kakabu, is here written with the determinative mul, which precedes any object that is a heavenly body. The adjective rabu means great, large, big. Not just a star, but a big one. The compendium is distinguishing this object from the smaller stars by which it is surrounded, although its light is dim. The verb here describes the light as weak, of low intensity. The astronomer is telling us that this is a star whose magnitude is not the brightest in the sky. It does not blaze like Sirius. It does not flare like Venus at her brightest. It glows steadily, but at a modest level, divides the sky in half. The Akkadian verb is pataru, to split, to divide, to cut. The object is the shamu, the sky. The big star divides the sky into halves. It is the marker of the meridian, the line that splits the celestial dome down its middle, and stands there. The verb is uzudzu, to stand, the same verbal root from which the noun manzazu, station, is built. The big star stands. It occupies. It holds its place. The same theological vocabulary that the Enūma Eliš uses for the founding of the celestial stations is here applied to the observational identification of a particular body. That is the star of Marduk. Nibiru? Jupiter. 3 names given as equivalents. The star of Marduk, Nibiru, Jupiter. In the cuneiform, the names are MUL.APIN, UD, Ne Beru, and MUL.SAG, Mi, Gar. The first uses a divine determinative and means simply the star of the god Marduk. The second is the Akkadian noun we have been tracing through the night. The third is the Sumerian astronomical designation for the planet Jupiter, the planet that takes about 12 of our years to complete its journey through the constellations of the zodiac. For the compiler of MUL.APIN, working in the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, these 3 names refer to the same body in the sky, the wandering star that the Romans much later would call Jupiter, the largest of the planets visible to the naked eye, the one that, after Venus and the Moon, ranks as the most luminous of the moving objects in the night sky. But notice the phrase that closes the passage. It keeps changing its position and crosses the sky. The verb for crossing is the one we have been tracking from the beginning, Aberu, the root from which Nibiru is built. Jupiter in this passage is described as a body that both moves and crosses. It is not the fixed point. It is the body that occupies the fixed point at a particular moment, and it does so by crossing through it. Read carefully the MUL.APIN passage does not say that Nibiru is Jupiter as a permanent identification. It says that the star of Marduk, which is called Nibiru, which is Jupiter, divides the sky and crosses it. The identification is positional. Jupiter, for the Babylonians, occupies the meridian crossing function. But Jupiter is not the meridian. The meridian is the meridian. Jupiter is the body that, in their astronomical scheme, performs the office. This distinction is what allowed later commentators to apply the same term to other bodies. Consider the tablets known as K6174 and K112769, 2 fragments from the great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dated to the 7th century before the Common Era. The fragments contain astronomical omens, lists of celestial phenomena, and their interpreted meanings. In both tablets, the name Nibiru, written in slightly varying cuneiform, refers not to Jupiter but to Mercury. The sumerogram used is MUL.UDU, IDEM, GU4, which translates literally as the leaping wild sheep planet, a designation that the lexical lists assign to Mercury. The scholar Emanuel Friedman, in a paper published in 2015 in the Cuneiform Digital Library Bulletin, gathered together the evidence from K6174 and K769 from MUL.APIN from the Enūma Eliš, and from a scatter of other lexical and astronomical tablets, and reached a conclusion that has now become the working consensus in Assyriology. The name Nibiru in cuneiform sources does not refer to a single body. It refers to a position any of several bodies can occupy, depending on the season, depending on the year, depending on which celestial calendar the observer is following. Friedman's specific proposal is that Nibiru, in its widest application, refers to any visible astronomical object that marks an equinox. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. Any visible astronomical object that marks an equinox. The equinoxes are the 2 days in the year when the length of daylight equals the length of darkness. They occur in the calendar we now use around the 20th of March and the 22nd of September. The Babylonian year began at the spring equinox, in the month of Nisanu, when the sun's path crosses the celestial equator from south to north. The autumn equinox occurs 6 months later, when the sun crosses back from north to south. Twice a year, the great circle of the sun's apparent path intersects the great circle of the celestial equator, and at those intersections, the bands of the sky are crossed. If Nibiru is the name for the crossing point itself, then any bright body that happens to occupy that crossing point at the moment of observation can carry the name. Jupiter, when its orbit places it near the equinox. Mercury, when it appears as the morning or evening star near the equinox. The star Aldebaran in some heliacal risings. The star Antares in others. The function travels. The body changes. The name remains. This is what the older reconstruction by Benno Landsberger and J.V. Kinnear-Wilson, published in 1961 in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, was already feeling toward. Landsberger and Kinnear-Wilson examined the same passage from Enūma Eliš Tablet 5 that we read together. The lines about the founding of the station of Nibiru and the stations of Enlil and Ea. They reconstructed a section of damaged text in which the verb itabiru appeared, an Akkadian preterite meaning the one who previously crossed. They proposed that the Enūma Eliš was making a contrast. There were stars that had previously crossed, and there was Nibiru who, having crossed, now stood. The station of Nibiru in this reading is not where a body is. It is where a body has come to rest after the crossing is complete, the fixed station at the turning point of the celestial calendar. Hold this image in mind. A great circle drawn across the night sky, a second great circle, tilted at 23.5 degrees from the first, drawn through the same dome. The two circles intersect at 2 points. Those 2 points are the equinoxes. Around those 2 points, the entire annual cycle of the heavens turns, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the planting, the cycle of the festivals, the cycle of the king's ritual life. Nibiru is the name for those 2 points, considered as a single function, the crossing, the held station, the place where the bands of the sky meet. When the priests of Babylon stood on the ziggurats at the spring equinox and watched the sun rise on the morning of the new year, they were watching the sun pass through the station of Nibiru. When they watched Jupiter, the slow-moving giant, approach those same equinoctial points and stand there briefly before continuing on its long arc across the zodiac, they were watching the star of Marduk hold the crossing. When they recited the 7 tablets of the Enūma Eliš during the Akatu festival, they were recapitulating, in the language of cosmology, what they had just observed in the language of the sky. The cosmos was held together at the crossing. The crossing was Nibiru. The body that, at any given moment, occupied the crossing was the star of Marduk for that moment. What moves me about this picture, the more time I spend with it, is how unlike a planet it actually is. The thing the Babylonians were tracking when they spoke of Nibiru was not a single object that could be pointed at and named. It was a relationship between objects, a geometry, a node in a network of moving lights and fixed reference points, identified by its position rather than its substance. It is, in modern observational terms, much closer to the concept of a vernal point, or to a node of an orbit, than it is to a thing. And this is the point at which the modern misreading begins. Because, of course, the modern audience does not encounter the name Nibiru in this form. The modern audience encounters it in books, in podcasts, in late-night television specials, in the cascading mirror of internet pages that link back to one another. And in almost every case, the framing is the same. Nibiru is a planet, a large planet, a planet on an elongated orbit that takes thousands of years to complete, a planet whose closest approach to Earth, somewhere in our future or our recent past, is associated with catastrophic events, tidal waves, earthquakes, the flood of Genesis, the extinction of the dinosaurs, the end of the world. How did we get from a station in the sky founded by Marduk after he split the body of Tiamat to a rogue planet on a 3,600-year orbit? The answer is a single name and a single book and a particular moment in the cultural history of the late 20th century. The name is Zechariah Sitchin. The book is The 12th Planet. The moment is the spring of 1976, the same year, by a strange coincidence of timing, that Wilfred Lambert and a generation of Assyriologists at the British Museum were continuing the painstaking work of editing the Enūma Eliš fragments that George Smith had first brought back to light a century earlier. Now, let us walk into that book carefully. Because the work Sitchin did and the work he did not do are both important to understand. And the question of how we handle his legacy is not a simple one. Sitchin was born in Baku, in what was then Soviet Azerbaijan, in 1920. His family moved to Palestine when he was young. He grew up reading Hebrew and Aramaic, and he claimed, in later interviews and in the prefaces to his books, to have been one of the few writers of his generation who could read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform alongside the modern Semitic languages. The claim was contested by Assyriologists during his lifetime, and after his death in 2010, the consensus has hardened. Sitchin had a working acquaintance with the secondary literature. He could puzzle through transliterations with reference grammars. He was not, in the technical sense, a trained cuneiformist. His university degree, when his credentials were checked, turned out to be in economics from the University of London, not in ancient Near Eastern languages. This matters less than it might seem. There have been brilliant amateur readers of cuneiform in the history of the field. George Smith himself, the man who recovered the Enūma Eliš in 1872, had no university degree at all, and he learned Akkadian on his own in the evenings after work at the print shop. Self-taught scholarship can be excellent. Self-taught scholarship can also miss the technical subtleties that years of formal training surface. Sitchin's case is, by the assessment of those who are qualified to judge, the latter. But the cultural moment of 1976, when the 12th Planet first appeared in print, was perfectly suited to amplify the work regardless of its technical standing. The Apollo missions had just ended. The first detailed images from Mariner 10 of Mercury were fresh in the public imagination. The Viking landers were on their way to Mars. Carl Sagan was writing The Dragons of Eden. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods had sold millions of copies the decade before. The atmosphere of the late 1970s was saturated with the question of whether human civilization was, in some sense, a visitation from elsewhere. Sitchin offered a specific answer to that question, with what appeared on the surface to be ancient textual support, and an audience hungry for exactly that kind of synthesis received it with enormous enthusiasm. The central claim of the 12th Planet is straightforward. Sitchin argued that the Sumerians, the people who wrote the cuneiform tablets we have been reading from all evening, knew of 12 celestial bodies in our solar system. The Sun and the Moon counted as planets in their reckoning. The 9 planets known to modern astronomy at the time Sitchin wrote, from Mercury out to Pluto. And one more, a 12th planet, larger than any of the others, on an enormously elongated orbit that took it, by his calculation 3,600 years, to complete a single circuit of the Sun. That 12th planet, Sitchin proposed, was Nibiru. And on that planet, according to his reading, lived a race of beings whom the cuneiform tradition called the Anunnaki. Now let us put that proposal carefully, slowly, beside what the cuneiform sources actually say. The first claim is that the Sumerians knew of all 9 planets that modern astronomy recognizes, from Mercury through Pluto. This claim does not survive a careful reading of the texts. The cuneiform planetary catalogue is consistent across hundreds of tablets, and across more than 1,000 years of observation. The Babylonians, building on the work of their Sumerian predecessors, recognized 7 moving bodies in the sky: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. These are the 7 naked-eye luminaries. They are the bodies that move against the background of the fixed stars. They are the bodies that the astronomer priest could track and predict with their cuneiform mathematics. The Sumerogram lists in MUL.APIN in the astrolabes from Assur, in the astronomical diaries from Babylon that stretch from the 7th century, before the Common Era, down into the Hellenistic period. They enumerate 7 moving bodies. 7. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are not visible to the unaided eye. They could not have been catalogued by anyone working without a telescope. Uranus was discovered by William Herschel in 1781, Neptune by Johann Galler and Heinrich de Rest in 1846, Pluto by Clyde Tombaugh in 1930. Before the invention of the telescope, in the early 17th century, these bodies were simply not in the human inventory of the cosmos. They were not known to any culture, in any place on Earth, by direct observation. For the Sumerian catalogue to have included a 12th planet, the Sumerians would have had either to possess optical technology that no archaeology has ever recovered, or to have received the information from a source other than direct observation. Sitchin's argument took the second path. The Sumerians, he proposed, learned of the outer solar system from the Anunnaki themselves, who had travelled to Earth from their homeworld, the 12th planet. This is a beautiful and dramatic proposal. It is also, when we look at the cuneiform record, unsupported by any text. Now let us look at the second claim, the orbital period of 3,600 years. This is the number that has done more cultural work than any other in the Nibiru literature. The figure of 3,600 years is the supposed time between close approaches of the rogue planet, the interval over which catastrophes are spaced, the rhythm of cosmic disruption that the modern fringe author appropriates to explain everything from the flood of Genesis to the end times of the present millennium. It is also a number that comes directly from the cuneiform, but not in the way that Sitchin claimed. The number 3,600 is, in Sumerian mathematics, the value of a single named unit. The unit is called the shah, often written today as sar. The Sumerian counting system was sexagesimal, base 60. 60 was the basic unit. 60 squared, 3,600 was the shah. 60 cubed, 216,000, had its own name as well. The shah, 3,600, was used throughout Sumerian and Babylonian arithmetic. It was a counting unit, a round number in their system, in the same way that 1,000 or 1,000,000 is a round number in ours. In the Sumerian king list, the 8 antediluvian kings reigned for very long periods, and those periods are given in shah units. Alulim, the first king, reigns 8 shah. That is 8 times 3,600, which equals 28,800 years. Alalgar II, 10 shah, 36,000 years. The total of all 8 reigns comes to 241,200 years in the version on the Weld Blundell prism, the prism that sits today in the case in the ancient Near East Gallery of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the prism whose accession number is in 1923.444. The number 3,600 in the cuneiform record is a unit of counting. It is the same kind of cultural object as our dozen, our score, our gross, our myriad. It has a meaning within an arithmetical system. It is not anywhere in the textual record the orbital period of a celestial body. To extract from the shah the orbital period of a planet requires an additional move of interpretation. It requires the reader to decide that the unit is also a period of revolution. That move is not supported in any cuneiform text. The texts give us the number. The interpretation as orbital period is supplied by the modern reader, in this case Zechariah Sitchin, working with materials his training had not prepared him to handle. Now let us look at the third claim, the one that has had the deepest cultural reach, the identification of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings from the 12th planet. The Anunnaki appear in the cuneiform record with very high frequency. They are mentioned in literary texts, in ritual texts, in lexical lists, in royal inscriptions. The name itself is Sumerian. Da-Nunnaki, sometimes written Da-Nunna, often abbreviated to Nunna. The morphology is transparent in the Sumerian. An is the sky god, the highest member of the pantheon, the father of the other gods. Nun is the term for prince or noble. K is a genitive ending. The literal translation is something like the princely offspring of An, the princely descendants of the sky. These are gods. In the cuneiform sources, the Anunnaki are gods. They are members of the divine assembly. They sit in council. They render judgments. They allocate decrees. They are described in the great literary texts of the 3rd and 2nd millennium before the Common Era as the high deities of the pantheon, distinguished from the lower-ranked Igigi, who are the working gods of the cosmos. When the Atrahasis epic, the great Mesopotamian flood story, that in its old Babylonian recension predates the version in Gilgamesh by centuries, describes the Anunnaki, it places them in council. They are the senior gods who decide the fate of humanity. The flood is sent because the Anunnaki, in their irritation at the noise of the multiplying human race, decide that the population must be reduced. The text is theological. It is a story about divine governance and divine displeasure. It is not a story about extraterrestrial colonists. Nowhere in the corpus of cuneiform literature do the Anunnaki travel from a specific planet. Nowhere are they described as physical beings of flesh, blood, and metal who arrived in vehicles. Nowhere are they given a homeworld that can be pointed to among the stars. What the texts do say, repeatedly and consistently, is that the Anunnaki came down from An, that is, from the sky. The sky in Sumerian cosmology is a real place. It is the upper register of the cosmos. It is where the high gods dwell. The Anunnaki are the descendants of An, the offspring of the sky, the gods who have come down from above. This is theology. It is the same theology, structurally, as the cosmology of Genesis 6, where the sons of God descend to take wives of the daughters of men. It is the same theology as the descent of the gods in the Greek pantheon, the descent of the Vedic devas, the descent of the heavenly figures in countless world mythologies. It is a religious image of vertical sacred geography, heaven above, earth below. The crossing between them is theologically significant. To read this theology as a description of physical, interplanetary travel is to perform a kind of category conversion. It is to take a religious image and transpose it into a science fiction frame. The conversion produces something that is internally coherent. The modern reader can imagine spaceships, can imagine technology, can imagine flesh and blood colonists. But it is not what the texts are saying. The texts are saying something else, something theological, something cosmological in the pre-scientific sense of that word. There was a scholar named Michael Heiser. He died in 2023. He was a Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages specialist, with a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And over the course of about 2 decades, beginning in the late 1990s, he built up a careful, patient, methodical critique of Sitchin's reading of the cuneiform record. His website, sitchiniswrong.com, became the most thorough public corpus of primary source rebuttals to the 12th planet hypothesis. His paper, The Myth of a Sumerian 12th Planet, Nibiru, according to the cuneiform sources, remains the standard reference point for anyone who wants to compare Sitchin's interpretations against the actual texts in the actual languages. Heiser's central argument was simple. He invited his readers to look at the same tablets Sitchin cited in their standard transliterations and translations, and to compare the Akkadian or Sumerian word that appears in the text with the English word that Sitchin had substituted in his paraphrase. The results, Heiser showed, are devastating to Sitchin's case. The cuneiform word, translated as planet, in Sitchin's English, is in the originals the ordinary word for star, kakabu. The word translated as spaceship is the ordinary word for celestial body or for storm cloud. The word translated as rocket is the ordinary word for arrow or for divine weapon. In each case, the cuneiform supports a perfectly intelligible religious or astronomical reading. The interpretation as advanced technology is supplied entirely by Sitchin, with no support from the philological apparatus that the field of Assyriology has built up over more than 150 years. Heiser was not, by temperament or training, a debunker. He was a careful reader of texts. His objection to Sitchin was not that the modern reader should not be allowed to be moved by ancient material, or to speculate about the meanings of mysterious passages. His objection was that Sitchin had presented his readers with a translation that did not exist. With a Sumerian language, Sitchin had, in effect, invented to support a thesis his sources did not contain. There is a more difficult question underneath all of this, and it is the question that, when I sit late at night with these texts, returns to me again and again. Why does the Nibiru as 12th planet story persist? It persists, Heiser would have said, because it answers a hunger that the rigorous reading of the tablets does not satisfy. The rigorous reading gives us a meridian crossing point, a function in a pre-scientific cosmology, a station fixed by Marduk after the splitting of the body of the chaos dragon Tiamat. That is a beautiful object of contemplation, but it is not a planet on which beings live. It does not approach the Earth every 3,600 years. It does not bring with it the cataclysm that explains the floods of Genesis, or the extinctions of the dinosaurs, or the strange feeling common in late modernity that civilization is somehow on a borrowed clock. The fringe story answers that hunger. The careful story does not. What moves me about this, the longer I work with the material, is how much the careful story has to offer if we are willing to sit with it. The function of the meridian crossing in Babylonian cosmology was the function that held the cosmos together. It was the point at which chaos was prevented from returning. It was the line drawn across the sky that distinguished an ordered world from the formless mingling of the primordial waters. The priests who watched for the meridian crossing of Jupiter, who recited the Enūma Eliš at the Akitu festival, who pressed the observations of countless predecessors into the soft surface of their wax-coated boards. These people were doing something more than astronomy. They were doing what we might now call ontology. They were tracing in the movements of the sky the conditions under which a world could continue to exist, the function of holding the world together, the function of preventing the return of chaos, the function of standing, fixed and luminous, at the crossing point of the cosmic bands. That function had a name in their language. The name was Nibiru. It is a name that has, in our time, drifted far from its original meaning. It has been attached to a planet that does not exist. It has been associated with catastrophes that have not occurred. It has become, in some quarters, a watchword for end times anxiety, for the feeling that something is coming from beyond the orbit of Pluto to disrupt the comfortable assumptions of modern life. But there is something the original meaning still has to offer the modern reader. It is the recognition that the ancient astronomers were not naive. They were not, in their cosmology, describing science fiction colonists. They were describing the structure of a sky they had watched, with extraordinary care, across hundreds of generations. They were describing the points around which the wheel of the year turned. They were describing the celestial mechanics of stability in the only vocabulary they had. And the vocabulary they chose when the time came to name the most important of those points was the vocabulary of crossing, of ford, of ferry, of passage. The name speaks of motion held in balance. The name speaks of the place where the two waters meet without dissolving back into the one. The name speaks of the boundary that, by being maintained, makes the world possible. Nibiru, the ford between the bands, the crossing at which the cosmos holds. Now let us return for a moment to the people who first watched for it. They lived in a city whose name we now write as Babylon. They were called, in their own language, the Tupsharu, the tablet writers, the men who kept the records. They were trained from childhood in the Adubba, the tablet house, the school where reeds were cut and clay was kneaded and the long lists of signs were memorized through endless repetition. They were not a small group. The astronomical archives that have come down to us from Babylon contain the work of generations of these men, working in shifts, working in succession, each generation handing on its observations to the next. The diaries from Babylon, the records that modern scholars call the astronomical diaries, span from the 7th century before the Common Era down into the Hellenistic period. That is more than 500 years of continuous nightly observation, continuous nightly recording. The diaries note the positions of the moon, the visible planets, the brighter stars. They note conjunctions. They note occultations. They note the appearance of comets and the timing of eclipses, and the level of the Euphrates River, and the prices of barley, and dates and sesame oil, in the markets in the city below the observation tower. These observations were not casual. They were the central work of an institutional culture. They were funded by temples. They were preserved in dedicated archives. They were copied, recopied, edited, and transmitted across centuries. What were these men looking for in their nightly watching? They were looking for stability. They were looking for the signs that the cosmos was continuing to hold together, that the bands were continuing to keep their stations, that the crossing points were continuing to do their work, that Nibiru, the ford between the celestial currents, was continuing to be where it was supposed to be. To watch for Nibiru in the practice of these men was to watch for the sign that the conditions of an ordered world were continuing. This is, I think, the central thing that the modern fringe reading misses. The astronomer priests were not waiting for a planet to arrive. They were watching every night to confirm that the planet they had named was where it needed to be. The work was conservative. It was about continuity. It was about the patient verification, generation after generation, that the structures of the cosmos were continuing to be available for life. When the Enūma Eliš was recited at the Akitu festival, the great New Year ceremony in Babylon, the recitation was an act of cosmic maintenance. The reading aloud of the creation, the calling up of the divine acts that had set the cosmos in order, was understood to be part of the work that kept the cosmos in order. Marduk had fixed the stations. The reciter retraced the fixing. The cosmos, by being narrated, was renewed. And among the stations Marduk had fixed, the station that came last, the station that held the assembly together, the station whose name was the 50th and final name in the great catalogue of Tablet 7, that station was Nibiru, the ford, the crossing, the point at which the cosmos held. Now let us think about what it might mean to live inside such a cosmology. For the Babylonian astronomer priest, the sky was not a stage. It was an apparatus. It was a working machine. It had components. It had functions. It had named parts that did name things. When you looked up, you were not looking at a backdrop for human drama. You were looking at the machinery of stability itself, working in the open, visible to anyone who knew how to read it. The reading required training. It required the long apprenticeship in the tablet house. It required familiarity with the signs and with their precedents. It required the cultivated patience that comes from knowing that the answer to your question is going to be available, but only across many lifetimes of observation. The astronomer priest did not expect to see the whole cycle in a single human lifetime. The records he kept were not, in their fullness, for himself. They were for the man who would sit in his chair 70 years later. And the records he inherited were not from contemporaries. They were from men whose names he might have known, but whose faces he had never seen. This is a culture in which time is long, in which the unit of meaningful effort is generations rather than years, in which the cosmos is something one tends, patiently, century after century, because the cosmos is the thing that allows there to be a city to live in, and a temple to serve in, and a son to inherit the practice. Nibiru in this culture is a load-bearing concept. It names the point of stability. It names the function that holds the bands apart. It names the place at which the chaos that was Tiamat is prevented from returning. To take a concept of that weight, and to read it as the orbital marker of an invading planet that will arrive at a date in the next few decades and end civilization, is to perform a strange transformation. It takes a stabilizing concept and converts it into a destabilizing one. It takes a name that promises continuity and repurposes it to threaten an ending. What moves me about the original meaning, the longer I sit with these texts, is the patience it contains. The astronomer priest watching from his observation platform did not expect the sky to disrupt him. He expected the sky to confirm him. He expected the stations to be in their places. And when he found them in their places, what he had found was the answer to a religious question, not a scientific one. The question was, does the cosmos continue? And the answer, in the patient reading of the sky, was yes. It continues. The ford is still being held. Now let us return to the room in which this story began. The room is in Oxford. The museum is the Ashmolean. The case is in the ancient Near East gallery. The light in the room is steady, fluorescent, slightly cold. The glass of the case has been cleaned recently enough that there are no fingerprints near the bottom edge. A small white card beside the artifact gives the accession number, and 1923.444. Inside the case, on a low plinth, is the prism. It is about the size of a brick. It has 4 faces. Each face is covered, in tight columns, with the small wedge-shaped signs of the cuneiform script. The signs are very small. To read them, you have to lean close. The man who pressed them into the soft clay, almost 4,000 years ago, leaned close as well. There is, between the modern reader and the ancient writer, a posture of attention that is identical, even though all the rest has changed. The prism lists kings. It begins with the line, "The kingship descended from heaven." It names the city in which the kingship first descended, Eridu. It names the first king, Alulim. It gives the length of his reign, in Shah units, 8 times 3,600, 28,800 years. The numbers continue. Podam. They become, by any modern measure, impossible. They were impossible by any measure available to the ancient compilers as well. The reigns of the antediluvian kings were not historical claims. They were claims of a different kind. They were claims about the relationship between the world before the flood and the world after. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, earthly. The mythological is gradually replaced by the historical. The numbers move down into the range of plausible human lives. The Sumerian compilers of the king list were drawing a line. They were marking the boundary between two kinds of time. The time of the gods and the demigods, with its vast reigns and its proximity to the divine, and the time of men, with its shorter spans and its earthlier kings. The line they drew on the prism in the case is still there. What moves me when I think about the prism in the case in Oxford is the quietness of it. It does not announce itself. It sits on its plinth. It waits. The visitors walk past. Most of them do not stop. The ones who do stop, who lean close to read the card, are reading the first attempt by any human civilization to write down its own beginning, to give an account of where its kings came from. To say, in clay, this is how we got here. The clay is intact. The writing is legible. The conversation between the scribe at Larsa around 1800 before the Common Era and the visitor at Oxford in the present year is still happening. Slowly. Across 4,000 years, with a great deal of patience on both sides. Somewhere else in the museum, in the same building, the cases hold other tablets. Tablets that mention the Anunnaki. Tablets that name Nibiru. Tablets that record the patient observations of the astronomer priests, the long counting of Shah units, the slow tracing of the celestial bands in which the cosmos was understood to hold. The fringe story of Nibiru, the story of the invading planet on its 3,600-year orbit, is not in those cases. It is in the bookstores. It is in the videos. It is in the algorithms that recommend one ancient mystery after another to the late-night viewer. It is a story about catastrophe, arriving from somewhere beyond the orbit of Pluto. The story in the cases is different. The story in the cases is about a civilization that watched the sky for stability and named the point of stability with the word for crossing, and built around that name an entire cosmology of patience and continuity. The story in the cases is about clay that has lasted longer than the empire that produced it, about a script that has lasted longer than the language it recorded, about a question, the question of where the kingship came from, and where we are inside the long structure of time that has not stopped being asked. I sometimes wonder when I think about the prism, what the scribe at Larsa would have made of us, of the room in which his work now sits, of the people who lean close to the case at 3 in the afternoon, in winter, and read the small wedge signs by the steady cold light. He would not have expected us. Exactly. But he wrote in clay. He chose, when he had a choice of materials, the material that does not hurry, the material that does not forget, the material that outlasts kings. He wanted to be read. 4,000 years later, we are reading him. If this story stayed with you, a like helps other wanderers find this quiet place. There is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other tablets, other names, other lines that nobody has yet translated. The Sumerians wrote because they wanted to be read. 4,000 years later, we are still reading them. The conversation is not over. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The tablet is still there, in the case, in Oxford. The accession number is on the small white card beside it, and 1923.444. The names are still on the 4 faces of the prism. The first one is Alulim. The first city is Eridu. The first line says that the kingship descended from heaven. Someone, somewhere, is reading those words right now. Maybe in Oxford, maybe in another city, maybe at the same hour you're listening. The reading continues. The crossing continues to be held. The cosmos, in the language of the tablets, continues. The ford between the bands, the place where the cosmos holds, Nibiru.